Now there's one little issue we have with your current environment, your current state, is we're using an Active Directory database for LoRax. And in that Active Directory database, we have all of our employees, but we also have all of our contract employees, our contractors, we have all of our partners, we have all of our vendors. Right now, all we have on in our visual policy editor is login, authentication. So anybody who has that LoRax user account, they've got access to the exact web top we just saw. But we don't want our contractors to have access to the Windows RDP resource. And we don't want partners and vendors to have access to the intranet and a variety of other issues. So we need to now take what you've done and we need to start limiting who can access what. You've just done the what part. You did the what. You created the resources. Now we have to get into the who, which is what we're going to do in lessons 3 and 4 together, talking about our authentication and our authorization first. So authentication is identifying a user based on a variety of things. Typically, it's a username and a password. More often than not, that's coming from an Active Directory database, but we're now seeing a lot of other methods being used for authenticating users. We use them here at F5 as well. But at most, we almost always have a username and password that goes along with it. The way this works is we have a variety of different back-end authentication server types, and we just need to make sure that APM is configured with the correct authentication server type for these credentials. What we can also, not everybody knows, we can actually store user accounts on the BIG-IP. There's a local database that we can use. But I doubt a lot of organizations want to use this little database for all of their user account access, but you could. So once we have the username and password, we will set it to the configured authentication server. Again, that server is only going to send back one of two answers. Every authentication is either a success or a failure. So if it's a success, then it's going to send that back. And they're going to follow the successful branch that we saw earlier, and that item looked kind of like that we saw. Now this user here, they mistyped their password. It's supposed to be 123. We've all done that before where we mistype our password. So we're going to get back a failure response from the Active Directory server, and this user is going to go the fallback branch. Now, in your first exercise, I did have you change the allowed number of attempts to 1, just to make that exercise quicker. But by default, they're going to get 2 more tries. They will get 2 more tries to get their password correct. But if they enter the wrong password 2 more times, then they're going to end up going the fallback branch and just be denied access. As you guys did, I would recommend a message box. Let them know why they're being denied access. Now, one of the great things about APM, all SSL VPNs have the multi-factor authentication available. I remember when I was at Aventail, that was when we released the new exciting feature to do a 2-factor authentication. That was a big deal, 2-factor. And it was very statically set up. What's your first authentication method? And there's a little checkbox. Do you want a second authentication method? Yes? Okay, what's the second? That was how you had to set it up. Now, with APM, what we can do, if we're going to be using more than one form of authentication, is we can just ask the user for all of those usernames, passwords, one-time passwords, pins, whatever they are. We can ask them for all of that on one login page. All of that gets sent to the APM. And so it's got all that information, and it can now just send what it needs to each configured login server. Oh, by the way, here, what's that? So now we can just send the username and password to Active Directory, get the results back. Now this says if because the first request was successful, APM moves to the next authentication method, but that's not how you have to do it. But in this case, that is how we're doing it. If they got in the right username and password, we then want to verify that they put in the appropriate PIN, the radius PIN off their little token. And if they pass both, that's where we would now move them from one success to the next success, now to the next hop. But that's not how we have to set it up. I like to say, is there a wrong way to set up multi-factor authentication with APM? And the answer is absolutely not. There is no wrong method of how to do this. It doesn't have to be so statically done like it was back in my previous company's multi-factor authentication, or I should call it two-factor authentication. For example, here we have this set up, as I just showed you, that if they succeeded with the Active Directory auth, that's when we would then verify their radius PIN. That's one way to do it. We could also do it this way. We could do three-factor authentication. First, they have to put in username and password. Then we check their PIN. Then we check their one-time password. We can actually have many factors of authentication. Some SLDPNs only allow 2. We have an unlimited number. But again, this doesn't have to be set up this way. Maybe what we did is, if they succeeded with Active Directory and put in the wrong radius PIN, maybe that's when we check the one-time password. Maybe we have multiple Active Directory domains. Our employees' domain, our partner's domain, our vendor's domain, who knows? And if they failed the first login with that first Active Directory server, instead of just denying them access right there, well, then we could take the username and password and check it with another Active Directory server, domain server. And if that fails, we could check it with a third one. They have to fail all 3 of those before they finally get denied access. No wrong way to set this up. It's just whatever the customer wants, how they want to do it. And that's actually a real benefit to APM. And we can only do it because of the visual policy editor. And we can configure pretty much anything we need in there, however we need it. Probably the biggest trick you're going to want to follow, or the biggest, I guess, rule of thumb you're going to want to follow with the visual policy editor, is try to plan as much of it ahead of time and map it out maybe on a whiteboard. I used to give that same advice when I used to teach SQL Server way back in, gosh, the late 90s. I used to teach SQL Server classes and even Microsoft Access classes. Database design is very similar. I used to compare it to an architect. An architect doesn't just start building up the house and building the walls. If they do, they're going to find that they have walls that don't match properly. They got to design everything. And we do the same thing with database design. I recommend a similar tactic with this because this is not a drag and drop tool. It's not in Flash. So if I decide I want to move things around later in here, you can do a little bit of movement with these fun little icons there, but it's kind of limited, and you may find yourself having to delete some things and then recreate them elsewhere. So the more pre-planning you can do ahead of time, the better. Again, summary, no wrong way to set up multi-factor authentication when you're using APM. All we need is just our different authentication servers. I need my Active Directory server for this domain, I need it for this one, I need my Radius server, and so forth. We just have to configure all of those ahead of time. Under your authentication pull-out, you'll see all of the different authentication methods we support. I don't know all of these. I don't know how to configure all of those. I'm not an expert I'm not a Kerberos expert. I haven't even used half of those. I don't even know what some of those are. So you would want to get some documentation if you're trying to help a customer set up some of those different, less common authentication methods. But what I will point out is when I select one of those, these configuration options for that are going to be different based on which one we select. So for example, I have radius selected here, and you see things like the type. Is it an authentication or an accounting server? You've got a shared secret and those kinds of things that you're not going to find on maybe an Active Directory configuration, where we have the domain name and the admin name and password and so forth. So you'll want to get to know some of those if you're going to be going out and helping customers get those set up. But they should typically know the settings of their own authentication servers. So now I have a few different authentication server types. Active Directory, I've got 2 different Active Directory domains and a radius server. And you'll see that every authentication server that we create here, it can be used in multiple places. We can use it in multiple access profiles and policies. It's not limited to just one. All right, so now that I have this set up, I've got my auth servers for Active Directory, I've got it for Radius, I now need to get it into my visual policy editor. And you'll notice that we have a visual policy editor that currently doesn't have any kind of authentication. Interesting fun fact is that's completely possible. You don't have to force somebody to log in to give them access to the back-end resources if you didn't want to. That's how we were doing it at Lorax, but Lorax has come to us and said, hey, we need to start having our users log in, please. So we're going to have to add a couple of items that we deleted. And we add items with the little plus icons there. These are all called items that we're going to add, all these different items inside of the visual policy editor. When you come here, you've got all these tabs of information. We're going to look at a lot of these tabs throughout your exercises, the last 2 exercises here. But I want to point out one thing. Do you remember earlier when I talked about creating a profile from scratch? And one of the fields with an access profile from scratch was the type. And I said, if you're not familiar with which type to choose, just choose the all. If you had chosen a different type, what it does is it takes some of these items out of here that are unnecessary for the type that you selected. That's pretty much the only thing that it does. I like to use all because I like to have all the different options available to me that I might want to use. So the first thing we need to do is present the user with that login page so they can put in their username and their password and their Radius PIN, because we're using Radius as well. So we're going to be using one of these login page types. You'll see there's quite a few to choose from, depending upon which authentication method we're using. What you guys have been using so far is the standard logon page item. And then I'll click on Add. Now, for the most part, you could actually just use this as is and come down here and click on Save. But we need to make a couple of changes. First off, by default, the login page comes with 2 fields, username and password. It creates session variables for both of those. The main thing those session variables are used for is for single sign-on. And so it's recommended to not modify those session variable names if you have no reason to, because otherwise you'll have to remember to reference those different names when you set up other objects later on for single sign-on purposes. So what I want to do is I need to create a 3rd field for their PIN, so they can enter their PIN field. Now, we have a couple of field types here. The text field type, the password field type. Anyone identify or explain the difference between a text field type and a password field type?
Does that get encrypted on the wire when it's sent?
Say it again.
Does that get encrypted? Password?
It doesn't get encrypted. Everything's encrypted because we're using HTTPS.
Right.
So everything's already encrypted.
You don't see the actual password when you're typing in?
So when you guys are putting in your username and password, sales user and password, when you type in the word password, it just comes up in those big round black circles. That's because it's a password style field. You see that all the time when you're logging into web pages out on the internet. So I've decided to make my PIN a text field so they can actually see the number they're typing in.
I could use password though if I wanted to, right?
The what?
I could use password if I wanted to for my PIN. It'd still work.
A password's title field? Yes,
Yeah.
but your users wouldn't be able to see the numbers they're typing in. And when they're trying to confirm it with their little thing, they're like, all right, I can't see it, and it's frustrating. I'm not as concerned about the security vulnerability of people viewing someone's PIN, because those are changing all the time. So I wouldn't be as concerned about that. Down at the bottom, this is just how the page is displayed. You know, that welcome text. I'm going to always want to change that, especially if you're doing a demo. Quick demo, change that welcome text so they can see a customized login page. We can also change the labels for those first two fields, like Active Directory username or Athens username, or we can put whatever label we want to help the users. And you'll notice when I added the third field, it added a third field label that we'll want to modify to something that makes sense. Let me click on save when we're done there. So we now have that storage space for the users. They put in their username and password, they send it along, APM now has it and needs something to do with it. What we're going to do with it is send it to auth servers. So we need a second item right after the login page. Do that. How about right there? There we go. And all of our auth servers are going to be in the second tab, your authentication tab. And all of these items that are getting a red arrow, every single one of those is a different auth server type. Everything from AD auth and LDAP auth, radius auth. Oh, but I can't see radius auth because it's down a little bit farther. So we've got a lot of different auth server types to choose from. You can't use one of these until you have the corresponding server created that we just saw a few slides ago. That actually has the settings of the IP address of the server and so forth. So we're using Active Directory authentication. We're going to select that. Click on the Add Item button. On this screen, you played with this a little bit in your first exercise. There's only one required element. Which server are we using? Again, these are one of those configured authentication servers that we created earlier. Remember, we have two Lorax domains, so we have to make sure to select the correct Lorax domain controller. Other than that, the rest of these, you can just leave them as is. Remember, you guys changed this to 1. We don't want to give them 3 tries. We just want them to immediately get denied. You probably wouldn't do that in the real world, though. And that's all I need for my authentication server. Specify the server that I'm using. For the most part, that's fine. Now I'm pretty much done. Wait a minute, no I'm not. That's where you were at the end of your last exercise. We still have that issue that all of my Active Directory users are getting access to those resources. We've got to limit who can access what, and that's where we're going to get into the authorization portion. We've got to start doing some authorization. So let's talk about how APM does this. I think this is really fascinating. I think this is a really interesting method of what APM does to actually achieve authorization. So if we have it configured to do so, which we're going to do in just a moment in the Visual Policy Editor, if we have it configured to do so, the next thing that APM do is it's going to send an authorization query to the configured server, which can be the same server we use to authenticate. Interestingly, it doesn't have to be, but it probably usually will be. And essentially what's happening in this authorization query is APM is saying, hey, can you tell me everything you know about Bob Smith? What all do you know about Bob Smith? How many of you have ever added users in an Active Directory server before? Okay, if you have, or even if you haven't, if you have, you recognize this. If you haven't, this is what it looks like when you go to create a new Active Directory user. And there's a lot more in a new user's dialog box than just their username and password. We have lots of stuff. We can put in their name, their location and their office, telephone numbers, email addresses, full addresses, more telephone numbers, organizational information like their job title, their department, their manager. These are all known as Active Directory attributes. This is all the information I'd like to know about this user. The most important one that I'm going to use, that we do most of our authorization with, are the groups that that user is a member of. So what happens in an authorization query is APM says, hey, tell me everything you know about Bob Smith. Active Directory then says, okay, here you go. And it sends all those Active Directory attributes about the user, including the groups they're in. And we can now use any and all of that we want to authorize the user. So first up, before I go any further, let's just talk about how we add this authorization query. I'm typically going to do it right after I get their username and password and I authenticate them successfully. So right after the AD auth is where I'll add this item. It's also on the authentication tab, and there are only two servers that we can use to authorize users that contain things like groups. And that would be an Active Directory server or an LDAP server. So we'll only have those two query items, AD query and LDAP query. We're using Active Directory, so we're going to select the AD query, click on Add Item. The first thing, and again, these are going to be slightly different about whether I use LDAP versus AD. The first thing, which server? Which server am I using? Again, it's probably the same user I used, the same server I used, to authenticate the user, but interestingly, it doesn't have to be. We might have our user accounts here and all their data over here, who knows? Anything's possible. These other fields can be used for some advanced querying stuff, like narrowing the search down to a smaller subset of the Active Directory database if we wanted. Other than that, we could just accept this screen as is. But I want to point out something that changed between version 13 and version 14. I think it was version 14. In the previous version of APM, as soon as I said, hey, tell me everything you know about Active Directory, tell me everything you know about Bob Smith, Active Directory server sent back every possible Active Directory field. Everything from their manager, their department, their title, their groups, and all of that. And for reasons I'm not knowledgeable about, because I don't know why they made this decision, they decided to now start limiting the number of attributes that were sent back. It's probably a bandwidth issue. They probably did it just so there's less information being sent back in every authorization query. So down here at the bottom, you're now going to see all of the attributes, the AD attributes that are sent back, like the display name, the DM, the employee ID. But you'll notice there's a few that aren't in there. There's no manager in there. There's no department in there. And I've chosen to actually use those, maybe, for authorization. Maybe I want to give access to everybody whose manager is Kevin. Who knows? But I can't do that right now without the manager field. This is actually, I learned this the hard way, because in your next exercise, I'm actually going to have you go and view some of the attributes about sales user. And in the exercise, it said, one of your questions in your exercise guide was, what's the user's department? And all of a sudden, when boot camp, somebody's like, I don't see the department in here anywhere. And I'm looking over their shoulder, I'm like, why is there the department display? I wasn't aware of this. I didn't notice this at first. So I had to figure it out and research and look and go, they made this change. They started limiting the number of fields. So I can add more. I can add some additional Active Directory fields, such as their department, their title, their manager. But here's the trick. How do I know what some of those fields from the Active Directory dialog box, how do I know what their correct AD name is? I got to know that. How do you suppose I even found this information out for those 3 field names? I had to find out the right ones just so I could create my screenshot. Anybody have an idea of how I could maybe figure out?
You must be able to query the entire properties.
Yeah, but that's tough. That means I have to have an Active Directory database available to me. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Let's say I don't.
Microsoft documentation?
So I have to go call up Microsoft and say, hey, can you send me all your documentation? Or I got to go
would
look
just
on their
go
website,
Microsoft.com
find all
and search
this.
for it.
You could probably find it there.
You will find it there.
But we just said I don't really have an AD server available, possibly. How else can you figure out,
Why would I configure this if I don't have an AD server?
well, we have it,
Okay.
but I am the APM administrator. I don't have login rights to the Active Directory, so I can't go over and just log in and start doing stuff on Active Directory.
Okay.
That's not my job. They don't want me to do that. And the Active Directory server administrator and I are not on good terms, so they're not going to help me out.
That was my next.
So how else do we find these kinds of technical things in our world nowadays? I'm sorry? I just went to Google. And said AD attribute names, and it gave me the entire list of every field in an Active Directory dialog box and showed me what the correct.
But I would prefer Microsoft documentation, just to be sure.
Hey, if you can get it, if you can go find the right guide.
Yeah. There is so much dirt on the internet. Yeah.
So now I've got this set up. However, this item is not yet done. On this item type, and on many of the other item types we're going to look at, you'll notice we have 2 tabs. Properties tab, but we also have a second tab, the branch rules tab. And this is the first item where we have to actually go and change the branch, because there's only 2 branches that come out of an AD query. There's the fallback branch at the bottom, but the other branch is this by default, that the user's primary group is 100. What in the world is that? We don't even have primary groups. And so this default branch for the AD query is always going to be replaced. You're always going to replace it with something. However, I want to point one thing out here. You have to be very careful when you're going to do this, because we do have to essentially get rid of this branch. But if you do it wrong, you're going to lose everything that you've already done. This way, in your visual policy editor, you're going to lose everything to the right of this branch. You might already have an advanced resource assigned that you've done all this work in. If you just delete this branch, you will delete the branch and everything else with it. What we want to do is actually change the branch, not delete it. When I change the branch, I can now see the branch's properties. This is the current branch properties. Now, I can say, okay, delete that particular branch property. I need a new branch property, which I can do by clicking on Add Expression. This is when Visual Policy Editor starts getting fun. Because you can see all these expressions here. If I click on that context, all these expressions that I can use to create branches. That's something to play with other access policies. For this particular item, the context we need is just AD query. We're using the AD query item, so we're going to use an AD query context. There are 3 sub-items here for an AD query context. They're called conditions. Those 3 are user's primary group is, user is a member of, and the third, AD query passed. For this particular item, that's all we need. We just need to know that they got query results. That's it. As long as we got something back from the Active Directory server, that's success. I'm not worried about what group they're in at this time. I don't even know what group they're in at this time. I haven't got a successful query yet. So this is how we set up the item. We select the server. On this tab, we change it to this, and we click on Save. The fact that I added additional Active Directory attributes, I just did that to show you you can do it. You normally don't even have to do that, and you probably wouldn't do that. Now I've got my new item, but we still have the same old branch name. The branch name we're going to want to change to something that makes more sense in our visual policy editor, like past query. So that it'll look now like that. So there's my branch. If they pass the query, they go this way, and they'll get their resources. We're still not done. But now I have the data. Now I have the information that I need. I want to point one thing out, and you're going to do this in your exercise. If I'm not sure, let's say Javid's logging in, and I'm like, I want to make sure that Javid and his team are the only ones that have access to some of my resources. But I'm not sure what group name Javid's in. So here's a nice, easy way you can do it. You could call the Active Directory administrator, but remember, we're not on good speaking terms, so I got to do it myself. But I've already got a policy that you can log into. So go in, log into the login page. Now you're logged in. Now I can go over here to my overview access reports, and I can run this report for the last hour, and I can see all of the users that have attempted to connect in the last hour. It's going to show me everything, whether they're successful or not. You're going to see them here, and whether they're currently logged in or not. And so what I need to do is I'm going to take a look at that account. In this case, it's Bob. And I'm going to click on Show Session Variables. Show Session Variables. Little tongue twister there. So these are all of the variables, session variables, that are currently being stored for this user while they're logged in. There's a lot there. You could play around with there and see all the data that a user session stores up. But what we're primarily concerned about right now are the AD variables. We're going to open up that. And here's where you're going to see all of the AD information we have now learned because we added that AD query item. We can see all the attributes, including their department, their manager, and title, only because I added those 3 fields. But in addition, I can see, let me go back here for a second, sorry. I can see the member of. The member of is the attribute used for group membership. So I can now see the exact groups you're a member of and go, oh yes, it's the IT underscore Lorax group. That's the name of the group. And that's the group name I need to reference when I go in to do my authorization, my next step of authorization. The next step of authorization is to actually do something with that data. We now have all that data. We can do authorization to resources, for resources using any of this data, but I would say probably 99% of the time, what you're going to be doing is using group membership. You're probably not going to do a lot of authorization using all these other attributes. So here's how I can set this up. You guys have all those resources that you created in your last exercise. We have a bunch of resources we've created. One of those resources is a network resource. I can now say, you know what? Only my employees group has access to the network resource. I also have a couple of RDP resources that I created, like you did in your last exercise. And I can now say, only the Lorax admins group members have those. I've got some portal resources. I've got my intranet. My intranet site. I don't want my partners to get to the intranet. I don't want my vendors to get to the intranet. Actually, I guess I do. Actually, everybody's getting into there. The employees, contractors, partners, and vendors. That's intranet or intranet? Yeah, it's intranet. Okay. I guess we have stuff for all of them on there. We also have a couple of web top links. We have our travel link that only our employees and partners should be able to access. And we have our HR website, which is a web top link that only our employees and our contractors should be able to access. And this is how it's now going to look for some of the different users that connect. For example, we have Fred. Fred has finally got the correct password. So Fred's going to log in, and he logs in successfully. So now APM does what next? It does the query, authorization query. Tell me what you know about Fred. Well, here's what I know about Fred. They're in the partners group, among other stuff. But we're not worried about the other stuff. We're only worried about the group. So Fred is only going to see stuff that partners have access to, which is this and this. And when Fred sees his web top, this is what Fred is going to see. It's not going to see all those icons for all those other resources. Julie is going to log in, and then we're going to do the authorization query as soon as we get a successful login. And Julie is in the employees group and the sales group. Well, we don't have anything identified just for the sales group, so that's just kind of irrelevant for us. But employees have access to these 4 resources, and Julie's going to see her web top that looks like this. Bob is going to log in, and when we perform the authorization query for Bob, we'll see that Bob is a member of a couple of groups. Bob's a member of the employees group and a member of the admins group, the Lorax admins group. So he's going to get this resource and that one and all of these. When you're a member of more than one group, you get the resources for every group you're a member of. So Bob's going to see all 6 of our resources on his web top. This again is kind of like dynamic resource access. But now, in your lab, we would easily be able to set it up so that the contractors did not see that Active Directory server resource that you created. Very easy to do. Let's talk about how we actually do it now in the Visual Policy Editor. Anyone guess where I'm going to go to do that? I'll give you a hint. I'm not going to be adding a new item to this Visual Policy Editor.
Query?
It's not inside the query, so we've now limited it down to
The one after the past query between allow and AD query.
Advanced resource assigned?
it's actually going to take place inside the advanced resource assign. We're going to do everything I just showed you inside of there. This is what you were using in your last exercise, actually. Remember this? This was the what. This is what you did in your last exercise. These were all the resources. But if we just leave it like this, every Active Directory user gets those resources. You might have seen that top part, the expression empty. Maybe even wondered what that was for. And you just said, well, I don't know. But that's where we're going to identify the who. Oops, sorry. There we go. Currently, everybody has access. That's where we're going to identify the who. Who gets access to these resources here. So to do that, we're going to click on that change link. And now I need to do something with the group membership. We just saw a very similar screen to this. I'm going to click on Add Expression. The condition is going to be the same one we were using. We're doing some querying here, some AD querying. So the condition will stay the same. But we're now going to use a different sub-condition. I'm sorry, the context will stay the same. We're going to use a different sub-item, which is a different condition. We're no longer going to use past query. We'll now use that the user is a member of. And we'll put the group name here. Unfortunately, the group name does have to go in LDAP syntax. And it has to be perfectly typed LDAP syntax. If there is even a space in there, it's not going to work. And that may cause some of your exercises to not work if you don't follow my instructions of using the copy and paste guide. If you decide to type in the LDAP syntax yourself and you accidentally include a space, you're going to get wrong results. So how am I going to get the LDAP syntax for my admins group? Gosh, I could always email the Active Directory administrator, but remember, he's not answering my emails right now.
Can do AD query from command line. That's
Yeah, I get, well, where?
Just look in the logs,
Yeah,
the
the report.
APM.
Which one?
The report of the APM.
Oh, that's right, remember? We had it in our report. I could have Bob log in. Bob, you're an admin, will you please log in? Let me run the report. Look, there's my group name right there. An exact, perfect LDAP syntax. And I could literally just copy that and then paste it in that field. That's by far the easiest way to do it, unless you know for a fact what your LDAP syntax is. But even then, this avoids any typos. So now that's all I need to do. I can click on Add Expression. And now what we have here is a completed expression. Only Lorax administrators are going to get those 3 resources. And if I just said save and apply policy and I thought I was done, what's going to happen when an employee logs in? They're going to get a dead page. They're going to get a dead page because nothing's been given to them. They don't have any resources here, including a web top. They don't even have a web top. So we have no web top to display to them. So what we need to do now is click on Add New Entry again and add an appropriate entry for my employees and another entry for my contractors and partners and vendors and anybody else that needs resources to a point where it might look something like this. So I now have my admins with their resources. I have my employees with their resources, contractors, and you'll notice up at the top, I've recognized that both my partners and my vendors, they get the same resources. So there's no reason to create 2 expressions for them. I can just use the OR statement. Combine them together. Another thing to notice here is that we have utilized multiple web tops. I have a Lorax web top for these 2 groups. I have a contractor web top here and what I've called my partner web top here. And each web top just looks different. It's got a different look and feel. So now let's review what happens when these different users log in. Starting with Greg. Now Greg's in the contractors group. So when Greg's in the contractors group, we're going to look and see, what does he match here? Well, it only matches that expression. So Greg will see these resources on that web top. And then we have Julie that logs in. Remember, Julie was in the employees group and the sales group. Well, we don't have any entries here for the sales group, so that's irrelevant. But Julie's only going to match this expression, so she'll get all of those resources on the Lorax web top. Then Fred's going to log in, and Fred's a member of 2 groups. Remember, we can be a member of multiple groups. He's in the employees group, but he's also in the partners group because he's our Lorax partner administrator. That's what he works with our partner programs, so he's in the partners group. That means that Fred's going to match that first expression. They're in the partners group. Fred's also going to match the third expression. They're in the employees group. They're going to get all of those resources and all of these resources. But here's a tricky part. I can give a user tons of portal resources. I can give them tons of web top links. I can even give them 1 or 2 network resources. But we can only have 1 web top. I can only have 1 landing page. I can't have 2 landing pages. So right now, Fred has 2 web tops assigned to him. The partner web top and the Lorax web top. Which do you suppose Fred's going to end up seeing displayed on his screen? Any guess?
Probably the top one.
It's going to be the top one. It's going to be whichever web top he was assigned first. The partner web top. And that doesn't make sense. Fred is a Lorax employee. They should be getting the employee's web top. And that's why we have these little icons over here. The only reason order makes any difference here is for web top assignment. So I'm going to want to make sure that I put my employees. Oh yeah, so I'm just pointing out that we have all these different web top types, and we have to think about that. So I'm going to, which web top? I already answered this question, so forgive me. The web top we want Fred assigned to is the Lorax web top. So I'm going to just use those buttons to move these around. So I've moved this one. There we go. Sorry, I totally messed up my own slides there. Which web top do we want him to be assigned is the Lorax web top. So I can now use these buttons over here. I can move that up a couple of times until it's above this one. And that's the moral of that story. That's how we set up authorization. We do the AD query first to get the attributes, and then within here, we can use those attributes. But more often than not, we're just going to use the groups, the group names. That might be the one part of what we're going to cover that you would probably have to show how to do this. But once you know how to do it, it's fairly simple. So in our environment, we're right now only worried about contractors. We have our employees and we have our contractors. Right now, all of our contractors are seeing all of our resources that you created in your last exercise. So what you're going to do is you're going to go add the AD query to your existing policy, access policy. Then you're going to view some of the attributes. You're going to log in as a couple of your users and go run that report so you can get a feel for how you can view all those attributes. Then you're going to modify your advanced resource assign. So you'll add a new entry just for contractors and give them their limited number of resources. But then we want to make sure to change that existing expression, the one you already have, change that so it's only being used by employees. And I think I might even have you make a modification to that as well.